Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Taking Flight, the Future of Sustainable Aviation Fuels. My name is Ronald Dahlia, Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Now, presenting today are my colleagues, Christine Marshall, Associate Research Director, and Mukunda Kaushik, Analyst here at Lux Research. Now, throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen. And time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. But if your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. Now, let's jump into the presentation. Christine, Mukunda, over to you.
Thanks, Ronald. So if you take a look at the image on the screen, this was taken in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. This was actually an image from a telegram that Orville Wright sent to his father to announce the first 4 successful flights of the infamous Wright Flyer. This was back in 1903. When the Wright brothers took their first flight, it was only 12 seconds long and went 120 meters. Not a huge feat by today's standards, but before that time, aviation was merely a pipe dream shared by a few crazy inventors around the world. And if you fast forward, it's really incredible to think what had to happen to go from that point in time, back in 1903, to where we are today with regards to aviation. Over the years, better airplanes and engines had to be designed to go further for longer, pilots had to be trained, and airports had to be established. I mean, put yourself in the exact moment that bathrooms were integrated onto commercial flights. Now that's scale. And these are all factors that had to be considered for aviation to become commonplace means of transportation. But looking forward to the future, there are entirely new challenges that the aviation industry faces as it continues to grow. By 2040, the aviation sector is projected to grow to transporting 8 billion passengers worldwide, leading to over 3 billion tons of CO2 emissions without any intervention. And as a result, and recognizing this, a few years ago, over 300 airlines, as part of the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions from their operations by 2050. This is really a significant point in time because it gave a clear timeline for the industry with regards to decarbonization. But what does that mean for a single airline moving forward? I mean, let's take United Airlines, for example. And here's a fun fact about United. It serves the most number of destinations, 238 destinations in the US and 118 additional in 48 other countries. And it's third place with regards to fleet size and revenue. And United has indeed pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. What will United be doing with technologies? Which ones will it be investing in to achieve its goal? So aside from things like better designed airplanes and improved materials, there are a few options that airlines are exploring when it comes to powering aviation. And the 3 main ones being electric aviation, hydrogen aviation, and sustainable aviation fuels. And a simple way to compare these options is by looking at their energy densities. At the end of the day, the challenge for things like electric aviation and hydrogen are going to be with regards to having much lower energy densities than jet fuel. For example, the energy density of lithium-ion battery is about 0.3 megajoules per kilogram versus over 30 megajoules per kilogram for kerosene. That's 2 orders of magnitude smaller. So, while other chemistries are being explored beyond lithium, like silicon anode and solid state batteries, they still don't change this magnitude of difference. So that means for traveling really long distance, in order to have the same energy as a conventional jet fuel powered aircraft, you're going to need a really big, heavy battery. And that's just not going to work, and why most electric aviation is being considered for taxiing and short duration flights. Another way to look at this is, where can we fly, right? So if we look at the United States and where United could go in terms of the different types of aircraft, let's take Houston, for example, just because Lux was recently in Houston for its Lux Forum, and it's one of United's hubs in the United States. Where can United go from Houston with, say, an electric powered plane? So for the time being, the range for an electric motor configuration for a commercial aircraft of around 100 passengers is about 430 miles. So the plane could support United with trips to maybe Austin, San Antonio, and New Orleans, but it couldn't make either coast or international destinations. For hydrogen, the situation is a little bit better. Airbus, for example, aspires to launch a 200-seat, 2,300-mile airliner using liquid hydrogen combustion, and the plane could support United with maybe domestic trips to Mexico, domestic trips and trips to Mexico and Canada, but it couldn't make transatlantic or trans-Pacific flights. And then another consideration is that hydrogen is still very early stage in terms of development. So this project from Airbus isn't really expected to amount to anything until 2035. And even then, it's likely to be a smaller aircraft. So that just leaves us with sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF. It's already commercially available, albeit more expensive, but it can take United wherever it wants to go with regards to range. And it wouldn't necessarily require an overhaul of airline fleets because SAF is blended with conventional fuel for today's jet engines. So if you look at United's portfolio, most of its investments are indeed in SAF developers. It does have some investment in, maybe one investment in hydrogen and some in electric aviation. These are more for smaller aircraft. Still, with regards to decarbonizing aviation, I would say we're in that Wright brothers moment, right? SAF has been piloted for a few flights, but looking to 2040 and 2050, it's really, the future of decarbonizing aviation is hinged on the ability to scale SAF. So if we look at this conventional valley of death image, essentially these are steps you need to be taken to transform risk into value. You can think of there being two valleys of death, one for piloting a technology and one for scaling a technology. So the valley for piloting a technology is demonstrating that it works, demonstrating a complete system can be built to make a product and that the product works as intended in real world environments. And then to scale up, you use these learnings. And I would say that the second valley of death is where you take into consideration things like feedstock availability, the availability of infrastructure, and the scale of investment required to achieve mainstream adoption of a technology. And this is where SAF currently sits. So even though SAF technologies have passed this proof of concept phase and have been demonstrated for flights, there's still more that needs to be done and more considerations that need to be made for ensuring their widespread adoption. And this is why my colleague, Mukunda Kaushik, is here to walk us through the considerations for scaling SAF, describe where the different SAF production pathways sit today here on this valley of death, and he's going to paint a picture for what technologies are most likely going to be tapped on to meet 2040 goals and beyond.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. So in this section, we look at the main levers that determine the successful scale-up of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, firstly, this might be stating the obvious, but we need a scalable technology, one that can actually produce the hundreds of millions of gallons per year needed. Second, we need to look at the feedstock, a feedstock that's not only abundant and won't pose supply chain issues, but also one that is sustainable and low carbon. And then we need a technology that can achieve low cost when scaled in the long term. And lastly, we also need robust developers to actually develop the projects because it's really challenging for a single startup to succeed within the space. And when we look at SAF pathways, we look at three main pathways, hydrotreated esters and fatty acids, or HEFA, Fischer-Tropsch, and alcohol to jet. These are the three main pathways to produce SAF today, and they each have their own advantages and challenges because of which they differentially check the 5 boxes that you see here. So starting with HEFA, Today, this is the only commercial pathway to produce SAF, and it relies on waste oil, soybean oil, for example, used cooking oil, and animal fat. And these oils are hydrogenated and then refined to produce jet fuel range hydrocarbons. And the HEFA pathway has been commercial for over a decade. So there's little room for technology development. And the key consideration or the bottleneck here is the feedstock. A lot of the companies using first generation vegetable oil are looking to move away from this and towards waste oil to have a better carbon intensity score. And the largest company that's operational here is Neste, based in Finland, and they have 2 operating biorefineries with a combined capacity of 3 million tons per year. And a lot of this today is going towards biodiesel and road transportation. But again, if there are enough offtake agreements, these facilities can switch to producing SAF. But the main challenge here is that either the first generation oils are not sustainable or any other waste oil is just not accessible. So while HEFA is commercially ready and sits quite on the right in our scale valley of death, we don't expect it to fully get past the uphill because there just won't be enough feedstock. So what we really need is a SAF pathway that is compatible with abundant and sustainable feedstock beyond waste oil. And that's where Fischer-Tropsch can come in. So in this second pathway, you need syngas, and you thermocatalytically convert that syngas into liquid hydrocarbons, which are then refined into fuels in the range for jet fuel, diesel, or naphtha. And this technology is still in development. And while the main challenge here is not the feedstock, it's more so the cost and the integration of syngas production with syngas conversion. Right, so the benefit here is that you're tapping into a whole range of feedstocks that are not waste oil. Like take Fulcrum Bioenergy, for example, they produce their syngas from biomass gasification or MSW gasification. And municipal solid waste is what Fulcrum's doing in its first demonstration facility for about 10 million gallons per year. But both gasification and Fischer-Tropsch are capital intensive, which makes the integration really complex and renders the project quite expensive. Right, so the same holds true even if we move away from biomass. Right, so let's take the Arcadia eFuels example here. Based in Denmark, soon to be in the US, Arcadia combines CO2 with green hydrogen to make syngas using reverse water gas shift technology. And then that syngas is converted into jet fuel with Fischer-Tropsch. And now integrating reverse water gas shift and Fischer-Tropsch is again quite capital intensive. But from a feedstock perspective, Arcadia is partnered with Plug Power, which is going to be providing a 280 megawatt electrolyzer for this project. They'll be using biogenic CO2, which is sustainable as well. And Shell Aviation will be off-taking the fuel. Right? So the choice of feedstock fits the bill, and there's some strong developers here. Both Fulcrum and Arcadia will be working with Topsoe and Johnson Matthey's Fischer-Tropsch technologies. But again, the integration is complex and the Arcadia project is not yet operational, which is why Fischer-Tropsch sits slightly behind HEFA in our value of death figure. Right? So Fischer-Tropsch solves the feedstock issue by expanding into biomass like forestry, agricultural waste, MSW, CO2, and green hydrogen. The last 2 are theoretically virtually endless feedstock with the involvement of the oil and gas industry. But Fischer-Tropsch falls short in its economics because of the complex integration, whether that's gasification or reverse water gas shift. So what we need now is a SAF pathway that continues to tap into an abundant feedstock, but is less complex and expensive. And that's where alcohol to jet, the third pathway, comes in. This pathway uses alcohols like ethanol or isobutanol, and then first converts them into their respective alkenes. And then these alkenes are oligomerized into long-chain hydrocarbons, which are then refined into jet fuel range hydrocarbons. The oligomerization step is really the key part of this conversion process, and it's also where a lot of core oil and gas IP sits. This technology, again, is still in demonstration. The first facility is from LanzaJet in the US, which began operations in January 2024, so just 2 months ago. And they're going to be using first generation ethanol. So unfortunately, that's not sustainable. And we spoke to LanzaTech quite recently, and they informed us that while this facility does use first generation ethanol, they have a lot of other projects in their pipeline in the UK, Australia, and India, for which they're exploring gasifying agricultural waste, wood residue, or even waste sugarcane biomass to provide a feed gas for their SynBio platform to produce the necessary ethanol. So they'll plan to use that instead of their first generation. The advantage here is it's a less expensive system and less expensive feedstock because you don't need carbon capture and green hydrogen. But again, it does remain to be seen if this technology is cheaper than the Fischer-Tropsch pathway. So alcohol to jet potentially can have a lower cost and potentially have the right feedstock. But again, there's no strong group of corporate developers here. Now, LanzaTech has done a good job with scaling their technology so far, but it'll be challenging for them to independently set up the multiple facilities or even the hundreds of facilities needed to meet the demand for SAF in a given region. So coming back to our 5 levers, right? So we saw that HEFA, Fischer-Tropsch, and alcohol to jet don't check all 5 of these boxes the way they are today. So is there a SAF production pathway that can check all 5 of these boxes? We see potential in one, and that technology is methanol to jet, which benefits from the scalability of the alcohol to jet platform. But instead of using first generation ethanol, you use green methanol. And where will this green methanol come from? It can come from either biomass that's gasified, or it can come from CO2 and hydrogen, right? So methanol to jet is scalable. It's tapping into a lot of abundant feedstock, and that feedstock is low carbon and sustainable. The next lever is cost, right? So any SAF pathway is about twice the cost of conventional jet fuel. And what you also see in this figure is that both Fischer-Tropsch and alcohol to jet are more expensive than HEFA. But given that HEFA has a dwindling feedstock, there is an emphasis on developing Fischer-Tropsch and alcohol to jet platforms. And if you compare methanol to jet with Fischer-Tropsch using CO2 and hydrogen, the 2 pink bars that you see here, what you see is that they're both expensive than HEFA, but methanol to jet solves the feedstock issue for HEFA at a lower cost than Fischer-Tropsch. But there's 2 things to note here. First, methanol is not certified as a feedstock for alcohol to jet platforms today. That's limited to ethanol and isobutanol. So there will be some regulatory advances still needed. And also, methanol to jet is still early, but we do expect it to be a scalable technology whose costs will come down in the long term. And why do we think methanol to jet will scale? It's because of the last lever here, the presence of very strong and robust developers. In the last 2 years, ExxonMobil, Topsoe, Honeywell, Accents, and Total Energies with Masdar have all independently announced development of their own methanol to jet platforms. And these are major corporations with a strong record within the gas to liquid space. And they have the capability to both scale the technology, set up the necessary projects, as well as bring in the necessary regulatory approvals needed. So for these reasons, we think methanol to jet can check these 5 boxes. But when we think about scaling SAF, what does scaling SAF look like for the US specifically? The US SAF Grand Challenge, set out by the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, as well as the Department of Agriculture, has aimed to expand domestic SAF production to 3 billion gallons per year by 2030 and scale that further up to 35 billion gallons per year by 2050. Right? So why is the Department of Agriculture's presence here important? Because where's the SAF going to come from? Right? The US has stated that most of the 2030 target of 3 billion gallons per year will be met by HEFA, and the other 2 pathways will at least partially rely on biomass. Right? And a study done by the ICCT for the availability of biomass in the US to make SAF today shows that waste oil is quite limited in feedstock availability. In fact, it's the least available of all the biomass options. And to tap into forestry, energy crops, MSW, and agri-residue, we'll need fish trough or alcohol to jet. And this graph, in a lot of ways, is the baseline problem to scale SAF for the US. Because the 440 megatons per year of biomass that you see can produce about 22.5 billion gallons per year of SAF. This means that the US can quite comfortably meet its 2030 targets. But beyond that, the feedstock really starts to get limited. And you end up with a 12.5 billion gallons per year deficit compared to the 2050 target. So the US will have to find a way to fill up that deficit after 2030. One way to fill that deficit is to tap into e-fuels, right? So using feedstocks that is not just for 40 megatons per year of biomass. Producing 12.5 billion gallons per year of e-fuels will require about 144 megatons of carbon dioxide that's coming from carbon capture and about 86 gigawatts of electrolyzer. And this is quite a tall ask. But this is one way in which the US can meet its 2050 targets. But there's a big assumption in this figure, one that I'm sure Chris is thinking of already, is that not all of this biomass will go towards SAF production. There are competing applications.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the Biden administration just 2 years ago announced that it would be injecting $2 billion into supporting biomanufacturing in the United States, and not just for fuels, but for biochemicals as well. Moreover, the White House, almost exactly 2 years ago, a year ago to this day, released its bold goals for U.S. biotechnology and biomanufacturing. And those were some pretty ambitious goals, but one was in particular stood out, and that was that in 20 years, 90% of today's plastics and other commercial polymers would be produced from polymers derived from bio-based feedstocks. And again, while these goals are more aspirational in nature, they do signal some potential for government backing for biochemicals. And also, we've seen some interesting projects come online in the United States or be announced in the United States. So for one example is Citronic. It announced a few years ago that it aimed to construct a 400,000 ton polypropylene plant in Nebraska by 2026. And just to put that into perspective, the current global capacity for biopolymers today is between 2 and 3 million tons. So that's a significant amount of capacity to be brought online. And when speaking with Citronic a few years ago, it was interesting. They said that they could target a place like Brazil, where sugar feedstocks are cheaper, but they anticipate some more regulatory support in the United States with things like the IRA, even though the IRA didn't necessarily, isn't directly supporting of biochemicals. They say that maybe it could be extended to biochemicals in the future. Other notable projects are things like New Energy Blue, planning to bring online a plant where it'd be processing 275 kilotons per year of corn to produce second generation ethanol. That's going to go, some of it's going to go towards producing ethylene for Dow's polyethylene. And then there's also organizations like Biomade with the sole purpose of helping to scale up interesting technologies in the bio-based materials and bio-based chemicals space. So all of this activity is happening here in the United States to drive bio-based biochemical industry forward. So if you go back to this image here that Mukunda showed earlier, if we were to take about 10% of today's production of polyethylene in the United States and convert it to bio-based polyethylene, that would be about 2 million tons of bio-based ethylene being converted over. And that would take about 4 million tons away from this pool of biomass. Not significant by any means. But if we were to increase this to 90%, biopolyethylene, this would eat a bit more into that pool. And in our calculations, it would drive the number of SAF available from 22.5 billion gallons a year down to 16.3 billion gallons a year that would need to be made up. There are still some additional considerations that would need to be made. For example, that SAF production in itself could help create availability of renewable hydrocarbons. For example, Infinium's project Roadrunner, that's expected to come online in 2026, it has a home for its SAF and its e-diesel, but it needs somewhere for its e-naphtha to go, and that e-naphtha could be used as hydrocarbons in crackers, and biomass balancing or mass balancing approach could be used for production of mass balanced chemicals. The other consideration, of course, is policy. Mukunda.
Yeah, and as of March 2024, the US will allow the use of corn ethanol as a feedstock for SAF production via the alcohol to jet process and provide an IRA credit of $1.75 per gallon of SAF produced with this pathway without any penalties for land use changes. Right? So if we think about the additional feedstock this unlocks, coming back to our original figure, all that corn, per our calculations, can produce about 9 billion gallons per year of SAF. Now, this is enough to fill the deficit caused by biomass being diverted towards the polyethylene production, right? But this is still not tapping into all the available corn feedstock. If we were to divert all of that corn ethanol towards SAF production, what we see happening is that you actually free up more biomass that can go towards the production of other biochemicals, right? So we've gone from about 6.2 billion gallons per year produced with corn to about 9 billion gallons per year. This is one way in which the US can meet its 2050 demand, right? And what we saw is that this has evolved from just using biomass and e-fuels towards actually diversifying the pathways and the compatible feedstock. So we're talking about 13.5 billion gallons per year using the HEFA pathway and traditional biomass gasification, 9 billion gallons per year for corn ethanol going into the alcohol to jet pathway, and the remaining 12.5 billion gallons per year using e-fuels that use CO2 and hydrogen that are compatible with the Fischer-Tropsch and the methanol to jet pathway. Now, it's important to note that this is one scenario in which the US can meet its 2050 target. It's also very likely that that corn ethanol can move towards biochemical production directly. Or another possibility is that instead of freeing up biomass for biochemical production, the corn ethanol can actually be used to reduce the reliance on e-fuels when carbon capture and hydrogen isn't as easily available. So this just comes back to say that in a lot of ways, thinking back to that first flight, we're still at the Wright brothers moment today, right? A few flights have flown around the world with SAF and production is starting to ramp up. But from now to 2050, things will look a lot different and it'll really require an entire industry to evolve. And with SAF established as the key enabler of decarbonizing the aviation sector, it's really important to pair the right feedstock with the right technology, right? So when we talk about feedstock, it's both abundance as well as the carbon footprint. And there will likely be a mix of pathways in the near term to help any region meet its targets. But of all the technologies available, we see a lot of promise in methanol to jet to scale SAF production, right? With a strong set of corporate developers, it shows potential to potentially be lower cost than Fischer-Tropsch. And lastly, the lack of competition from the biochemicals industry today, which is purely driven by regulations, can actually present opportunities to those operating refineries today. As we saw in some of the examples earlier, being flexible with the product output allows offtake from a lot of different industries. And this flexibility can leave companies quite nimble to when the biochemicals industry does indeed mobilize in the future and demand some of these feedstock and products. Thank you so much for your time. We'll answer any questions that may be in the chat now.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine and Mukunda, for this excellent webinar. So as Mukunda mentioned, we will now be taking questions that you may have on the presentation, and I see that there's already some questions in the chat box. So if you have a question, again, feel free to type it in the question box. And if we don't get your question on this call, then someone from Lux will be in touch with you shortly after. But looking at some of the questions that came in, I guess one question that I would like to ask the presenters today is around the cost of SAF. So assuming that the cost of sustainable aviation fuels will continue to remain high, what should an airline like United do? Should they buy carbon credits, from things like BST, or how should they offset these emissions if they can't afford to adopt SAF in their operations?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially given that a lot of the airlines have started investing in direct air capture startups, right? So I think, yes, there's a consensus that you will need some level of carbon dioxide removal to reach carbon neutrality. But there's an even stronger consensus that carbon removal does not negate the need for airlines to pursue direct scope 1 emission reduction. And this holds true for any industry generally, right? So offsetting everything instead of replacing your fuel is not a safe long-term strategy. But in the near term, the way aviation can think about direct air capture is you can invest in DAC for offsets, as several of them already are, and then use those offsets until SAF production actually ramps up. Right, so it's basically helping you buy time with a reliable and high quality carbon offset. And once the SAF is available, you'll retire these offsets and bring in a more permanent solution. And secondly, DAC and SAF are not mutually exclusive, right? So in the long term, DAC can be a feedstock for SAF, especially if there are mandates on minimum SAF requirements. You will need new carbon sources where you can't just think about offsetting, you will need to produce SAF. And if there are regulations like Europe is considering and not allowing the use of fossil captured CO2 to produce SAF, you will have to resort to DAC if you don't have biogenic CO2 available today.
Awesome. Thank you, Mukunda. Another question that came in, and I think this one goes to you, Christine, is around the biochemicals industry. So how realistic do you think, actually, that, looking at the growth of the biochemical industry today, how realistic do you think that it will become a very big industry in the future?
Oh, that's a really great question, and I think the numbers that we were presenting were a bit optimistic, if I'm being honest, and a lot of it comes down to, and most of it comes down to economics, right? Where the economics of these processes, they're still much more expensive, largely because of the feedstock inputs. And so there are things happening to try and bring costs down. So for example, with ethylene or bioethylene production, there's a lot of interest in developing catalysts to help with ethanol dehydration. And there is some interest in moving towards lignocellulosic feedstocks to, hypothetically, if you're using a waste stream, that could bring down costs, although the technologies, unfortunately, have required pretreatment and other types of downstream processing that have made costs not so favorable in the end. So with the lack of, some of these technologies to help bring down costs, we're going to heavily rely on policy, right, to create or drive adoption of these types of solutions. And so that's where, we're monitoring policies, is because we understand how critical they are for the growth of the bio-based chemicals industry. And, we've looked at numbers for the scale up of bioplastics more broadly worldwide. And a lot of the momentum that we're seeing today is mainly because of policy coming out in Asia Pacific, for example. So in the end, yes, the numbers that we presented, I think, are a little bit optimistic. And what it will come down to is technologies to help drive down costs, and also what policies are coming out to encourage the adoption of the and the scale up of the bio-based chemicals industry.
All right, thank you, Kristen. And there's a few more questions in the chat box, but unfortunately we don't have the time for these questions as we're almost at the hour. So thank you very much, Christine and Mukunda, and that concludes our webinar for today. And for the audience, the slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent directly to you via email today itself. Now, after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we would appreciate any feedback, positive or negative, that you may have to help inform and improve our future webinars. But for now, thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you.